Welcome to Office Hours 47. I'm here with Adam.
Hello.
Both of us coming to the warm indoors from the unbelievable cold and large amounts of snow that affect us here in Boston, hoping that you guys are a bit warmer and better off than we are. We've got a few common questions that you have asked, and let me just get to those first. One of you has asked, will I still get certificates of Part 1 to Part 9 if I finish them now? What's the answer, Adam?
The answer is yes, but you have to do it before the whole course ends with the end of Part 10.
Okay. And we have some terrific questions from learners about the module on the environment in China. And one question is, and let me ask you this, how precise are Chinese statistics about pollution? How do they compare with the rest of the world?
I think they're pretty good. They're getting much better. For example, the statistics on air pollution are quite reliable now, and they're actually collected in various ways from international sources as well.
Right. The days when you would, on your mobile phone, look up what the U.S. Embassy reading for pollution is, it would say heavily polluted, dangerously polluted, life-threatening, whatever it would say, and the Beijing municipal government would say mild fog.
Yeah, right.
Those days are over, happily.
But and with different kinds of pollutions, there's different levels of accuracy. For example, I think the air pollution indexes are much more reliable than the water pollution indexes.
Right. Well, let's see. One learner writes in, many people with masks in some video. You could have seen me with masks, too, on several trips recently. What do people really know regarding the pollution and the way to live better in their everyday life? Do you have a sense of how this affects
Yeah, they're certainly aware. When I went back to Shanghai last year, the people I knew there, the relations I had there, the first thing they asked me to do was to buy boxes of air filtration, like heavy-duty construction air filtration masks, and to bring them back to Shanghai because the price of masks was something like 600%
higher
of the retail
in China?
Price. Yes. So my suitcase was full of air filtration masks, giving out to friends.
This is a business tip.
Yes.
Another learner wants to know how different regions in China are responding to their unique situation. And I would say, in China, just like any place else, some places are better run than others. So Shanghai is a much better run city than Beijing in a whole range of ways. Beijing usually among the worst run. Chengdu, a step ahead of the rest by having compressed natural gas run all taxis and buses.
And because it's ringed by mountains, it really only enjoys its own pollution, so they're very incentivized.
They're very incentivized there. So you do have different incentives in different places and different policies. We have the question, as you remember from last time, that the former president of Tsinghua has been appointed Minister of Environment. What do we expect from his appointment? Knowing him as I do, I would expect great things from his appointment, but I cannot imagine, because he is a great scientist and a great leader, I can't imagine a more difficult portfolio.
Right.
Last question, how much of China's newly expansive foreign policy is energy driven? For example, to Myanmar and Laos, South and East China Sea. It's an interesting question. You know, Americans sometimes pointing the finger say, oh, China is interested in Africa or has interest in the Middle East only because of oil. Unlike the Americans, for example, who have made energy too much of a focus of foreign policy. People who have studied this most directly have found that there is not an obvious connection automatically between Chinese state-owned oil companies and Chinese foreign policy and the work that they do internationally. Many state-owned oil companies go make contracts and then sell on global markets, not repatriating back to China. It is certainly there is a component, a strong component of energy in Chinese foreign policy, as there is in American foreign policy, as in EU foreign policy, and at the same time, it does not seem to be extraordinarily closely coordinated. Right. Well, we have a question, a discussion question for you all. You watched Mike McElroy and Chris Nielsen, the interview that I did with them in Shanghai on a smoggy day in Shanghai. And we asked you the question, if you were an environmental policy leader in China, how would you deal with the country's environmental challenges? Which energy resources would you use? What would you do about China's dependence on coal? How would you increase access to clean water? These are tough questions. Now for Minister Chun, perhaps. What are some of the answers that learners came up with?
Yeah, one learner, RFS001, commented that if he were in charge, he would choose a diversified portfolio of resources. and he would make education about pollution a focal point. For certainly the diversified portfolio of resources, we see China investing heavily in nuclear energy.
Yes.
Every house on China almost has solar panels on the top. Wind energy, when you go to islands off the coast of China, the windmills would just cover the islands.
Right.
And of course, water, hydroelectric energy in the south of China is very dominantly used. So they do use a diversified portfolio of resources that's very region specific, whatever kind of energy resources they can exploit in different places. The user comments that if the public comes to criticize companies that are not clean, it'll have a much greater effect. But I think the public is quite critical.
Yes, I do too.
I think most of the protests in China now are actually environmentally driven. I think it's more than 50% of the protests now are a huge number at
and
least.
criticism of environmental excess or lack of adherence to environmental laws, this kind of online criticism seldom gets taken down by our always busy censors.
Right.
Teo Hua Kok notes quite rightly that tackling environmental issues is not for the faint-hearted, nor is it economical to carry out. Just the opposite. The Olympic blue or the APEC blue skies of Beijing showed the determination of leaders to make it happen despite obstacles, and argues for a balanced portfolio, as our previous learner did, of energy sources.
We also see a number of really creative solutions adopted by the Chinese government to address especially air pollution problems. For example, China now is the #1 nation in the world investing in weather management systems. So they will literally build rockets or take a plane, and then they take, it's basically frozen CO2 and some silver chemical compounds, and then they release it in the air to help with cloud precipitation.
Right.
So they're called cloud seeding. So they're trying to create rain, basically.
So we'll have to find out how this works. You know, Beijing is bidding for the Olympics, the Winter Olympics this time, not the Summer Olympics. And Beijing is absolutely cold enough to host the Winter Olympics. But the areas around Beijing actually get almost no snow in the winter. It's an incredibly arid climate. It's getting more arid all the time. So how are they going to pull that off? You think there's enough clouds to be seeded or enough clouds to be made and snow to be made?
Import snow from Russia, I guess.
Anyway. We have a very interesting comment from another part of the world, from Claude, who suggests that one should continue subsidies for the development of solar and wind power, try to use more natural gas. And he writes that he's writing from Texas. He says, we are in a stage 5 drought emergency in North Texas now, and people have been very good at voluntarily saving water, as the local government has shown the way. Price of water has gone up, but people are not allowed to use any water outside for any purposes. Local restaurants have to use disposable dishes and silverware, which has environmental issues, as he notes, or face extra taxes. Chinese government might use some methods as these as appropriate to the region. Other comments that we have from learners.
Stu _ makes a particularly good comment about biodiversity and arguing that it's very difficult to preserve if large segments of the rural population remain poor.
Yes, that's a great point. That is a very, very good point.
As we talked about, China is extremely biodiverse, at least at the moment, but it has an enormous population, and the rural areas are quite settled and very heavily cultivated. So this does threaten many species. He
mentions the idea of having biotourism, as it were, or tourism focusing on biodiversity. That this might help the Siberian tiger. Something needs to help the Siberian tiger, I'm afraid. Okay, and if we have just a couple more comments, but you have so many excellent ones. One of them, I think quite rightly, talks about the need, this is Mamez, of the United States and China to work together to reduce carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases and bring in the next largest emitters, India, Russia, Brazil, to work together with the hope that China can learn from the mistakes that we all have made for so long. And of course, we're speaking very shortly after, at the APEC meeting, a very bold agreement between President Obama and President Xi as a first step toward Sino-American cooperation on this. Other comments. We've got Ricardo Cuatros. What does Ricardo say?
Ricardo says that the first step is to recognize the problem, and he argues that ultimately naming is very important. He says giving soft names like fog to extreme environmental issues will not help to solve the problem, and I think that's very true. Although we do see somewhat a shift in the nomenclature and the naming of things. But yes, especially in Beijing,
And
there's
the
a lot
weather,
of
the
soft
weather
words.
reports still often call it fog, although everyone knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, right.
Final comment from Tigak argues for a multi-pronged approach which ends up with a strongly educational standpoint. He says, I would encourage universities and private industry to attract and train more experts in these fields that will be needed going forward, using budget allocations to further these effects. Transparency around pollution at a regional and national level to better inform the public, and the use of some of the newer laws put into place, that was the actual enforcement of such laws, because China does have reasonable laws in this area, and to allow environmental groups to file public interest lawsuits against polluters.
And we do see this happening. One of the major changes recently occurs in environmental auditing, where now local officials, part of their portfolio, part of the basis upon which they're judged for promotion and things like that, evaluation from the central government, is how well they manage the environmental problems in their region.
The good news on which we'll close, I checked the PMI score in Beijing right before we went on the air, and it's a blue sky day in Beijing. Unlike Boston.
Unlike Boston.
Okay, see you next week.
Thank you.